Lovely to see you again, Ruby.
It's great to be back, Luke.
Yeah, here we are. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. As I would have said probably in the intro, those of you listening, Ruby's been on the show before, and we talked about kind of how she got into the work that she does. And in that one, we went a little bit more into her origin story, mysticism, astrology, some of the things that are covered a lot on her site, the Numinous. I think that's what we called the episode, something like that, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So it's kind of fun interviewing someone for the second time because we can kind of skip the backstory and just go into like what's happening today, which is really cool. So I'll, in the intro, give the episode number if people want to go back. But anyway, it's nice to have you here in the new studio in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles.
It is beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's cozy. The last one we did I think it was in my Airbnb in
It was an Airbnb in
Chelsea
New York
or
City.
something.
It was
yeah,
in Chelsea. I think it was summer 2016 because I remember what top I was wearing, and that was the
Really?
year
That's
that was
funny.
the year that I wore that top. Like,
that's funny.
I mean, do you ever think about?
I never think. Oh my God!
Do you think about? I always remember things by what outfit I was wearing.
That's so funny. I have no idea. Probably because I always wear the same 10 items over and over again for years until they get holes in them.
That's good. That's very environmentally friendly of you.
Yeah, right?
It is.
Without
I read
even trying.
Somewhere recently, top tips for being environmentally sound. One of them was wear every item of clothing at least 30 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. I never thought about it from that point of view. The only time I really emphasize changing a lot is when I'm doing videos because I don't want to have a YouTube channel where I'm wearing the same stupid shirt, in 400 videos or something. Yeah, that's true. But I do kind of have my uniform. But what I remember about that conversation was that I think I did 12 interviews in 14 days or something like that. And I was super tired and I was way over caffeinated. And I remember when we recorded afterward, I was going, Luke, you talked way too much. And then I listened back to it and I was like, fuck, I did. I was like, you didn't get to say anything. So this time I'm like, I'm not saying shit, Ruby. You're going to talk the whole time.
Okay, you got it.
Apart from this intro. So give me just up to speed right now. What are you up to? What are you super excited about in real time in your life right now?
Well, literally today, I'm going from here to lead a retreat at the 1440 Multiversity in Santa Cruz, which is going to be beautiful. And I'm really excited to do that. And I'm looking forward to it as almost as a retreat for myself as well. My book, Sober Curious, came out December 31st. And so I literally began this year at full speed ahead on the kind of promo trail for that book. I think I did crazy about 10 events in the first 2 months of it being out. I led a Sober Curious retreat at Kripalu in February, and it's just really been go since then. And so I'm kind of looking forward to the next few days, as much as I'll be teaching and leading this retreat, as a bit of a retreat for myself, meaning a bit of a opportunity to disengage from the kind of constant barrage of emails and DMs and conversations and things that have been the backdrop to this year, but all of which to say I'm so grateful for the way this book's been received. It really seems to have struck a nerve and kind of hit the zeitgeist in a way. It's a conversation, this idea of being sober curious, that really seems to be bubbling, and so many people are getting really excited about it and wanting to hear about it. So it's been a really, really exciting start to the year.
And what are you going to be doing specifically at your retreat? Is it going to be focused around this idea of having an alcohol-free life?
Well, no, I did a specific Sober Curious retreat at Kripalu, which was 3 days and 2 nights. And I had about 30 people come, and we did lots of different kind of investigation around our relationships to alcohol, our perceptions of alcohol, why it is we drink. And people had come from all different walks of life. It was a really diverse demographic of people. Some who had been in AA and recovery and were looking for different ways to kind of reframe their experiences. Others who had never even spoken aloud before that they had any kind of an issue with alcohol and were very tentatively investigating what it might look like to change their relationship to alcohol. It was really fantastic. The retreat that's coming up, it's actually called Manifesting the Matriarchy. And it's with Alexandra Roxo, who is my collaborator on Moon Club, which is something I used to run. I actually stepped out of that at the beginning of this year because I'm doing too many things. And I realized that I've been spreading myself too thin, actually, to really be of service to the multiple projects. So the backdrop to Sober Curious really taking off has been a kind of a paring back a little the other things I'm committed to so that I can be fully available.
Did
for
anyone
this.
sneak alcohol into your Sober Curious event?
They did not. I haven't had. We had one event at Soho House in Miami where they served wine, and I'm fine with that, because the thing about Sober Curious, it's not necessarily saying alcohol is evil or you have to stop drinking. It's really about inviting anybody into a conversation where they get to investigate something which so often just goes under the radar. It flies under the radar. We're not taught to question our drinking until it becomes problematic, you know?
Absolutely.
And that to me, just the more I look at that, I'm like, how is that? Alcohol is something, it's a substance that's so widely available. It's one of the 5 most addictive substances on the planet. And it does have huge negative consequences for most people actually who drink. Like, most people who drink will have experienced a terrible hangover at some point in their life. And even if that's as far as the negative side appears to go, even that is something I think to examine. You know, why are we so willing to accept a hangover as the price for like a quote unquote good night out, or a few hours of relaxation, or whatever it is we were looking for in the alcohol, you know? So we had one event where they served wine, and I'm completely fine with it, because like I said, I'm not about like everybody has to stop drinking. It's really about creating an environment and a culture around drinking where anybody feels like it's safe and it's okay to ask whatever questions they need to come to their own relationship with alcohol that feels healthy for them. You know?
I like
to really
that. Yeah.
learn, to really know that in whatever situation, each individual can trust themselves to make the right choice for them with drinking. For me, it means I've got to a point where there's honestly like never a situation where alcohol feels like it's going to be the appropriate substance for me. Not because I banned myself point blank from drinking, but because I've got to a point where I'm so aware of what this substance is and what it actually does to me and the wider kind of ramifications, that I just have no desire or need for it in my life anymore.
Did you ever get to a point where you thought you might be an alcoholic or be addicted to alcohol?
Absolutely. And I think I was a little bit addicted. I have this theory that I talk about in my book because of the nature. The second chapter is actually called The Nature of the Beast, and it really lays out the facts, which, like I said, is that alcohol is super, super addictive. Like, it's in the list with heroin, cocaine, speed, and nicotine. Like, alcohol.
Really? That's so funny.
Alcohol's the other one that's up there.
I didn't even know that, and I was addicted to alcohol for a long time.
Right.
But I just thought, you know, it's just this rare gene that some of us have where, you know, you hit this certain tipping point and then you can't control it in your life. But I actually I never thought that much about alcohol itself becoming addicted, because I just think like either a person's born with that tendency or not, and those that aren't born with that are just free to drink as much as they want, and they'll never become an alcoholic, because I didn't think of it as addicted. I thought it was more about the person, not about the actual substance. So,
exactly. And this is very much the mainstream messaging around problem drinking or alcoholism or addiction, even when it comes to So I've really laid out, like, you know, alcohol is super addictive. We're also biologically hardwired to become addicted to alcohol. Our brains operate on something called the desire function, which means that we are literally hardwired to seek out and repeat any experience that either brings us pleasure or numbs or takes away our pain. Alcohol, on a very superficial level, appears to do both those things for us, right? So our brain is literally like, oh, great, I found this thing that stops me hurting and makes me happy. Oh, and it's super addictive. Oh, and then the third layer on that is that it's heavily, heavily marketed at us from like literally the age that we're old enough to understand. So I kind of lay out in that chapter my theory that it's actually kind of harder not to become addicted to alcohol than it is to have a perfectly kind of like neutral, take it or leave it attitude. I do completely acknowledge that, and as do, you know, many medical experts now, there are shades of grey and there's a spectrum when it comes to addiction, and perhaps that's genetic. My theory is kind of, just the more that I've looked into it, and I'm not a doctor and I'm not, you know, an expert on trauma, for example. However, a psychiatrist friend of mine, Will Stew, he believes that any addiction is ultimately a symptom of an unhealed or an unaddressed trauma. That we've, you know, something we've experienced in our lives. And trauma, that is a scary word, but it can be applied to so many different things. And all humans have experienced some level of trauma. And so he sees addictive tendencies and addictions that get kind of out of control and come to rule people's lives as literally being an attempt, the body's attempt to numb the pain of that trauma that's just sitting there not being addressed. And I do wonder if people who have, I haven't seen a study that shows a correlation between a kind of level of trauma, if you could even give trauma kind of like a rating, I suppose, and a more kind of like a propensity towards addictive behaviors. But it wouldn't surprise me at all. For example, I did learn that 80% of female alcoholics have experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault.
Wow.
So when you start looking at it that way, you can say, was I born with this genetic? Perhaps your trauma was something, perhaps it was, your mother's unhealed trauma that you have inherited in this life and that you're kind of like playing out for her. I think many of us are on board with the fact that we do inherit kind of, subconscious patterning from our parents. So perhaps your trauma is something you weren't even aware of. And yet still there's a part of you that's seeking a way to heal that or to numb out from that. And that's where these addictions can kind of really take hold. So ultimately, the psychological perspective, I suppose, is if you can find the traumatic event, whatever it was, and seek to address that. And I think, plant medicines are well known for really helping with addictions because they can help people very quickly identify, this is what happened to me, this is why it hurt, and this is how I can let it go or how I can move on from it, in a quite a mystical way.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think about going back to, I have this theory that anybody who drinks on a regular basis is a little bit addicted to alcohol. So in my case, I definitely had developed an emotional attachment to alcohol. There were certain situations where I couldn't even contemplate not drinking, like a wedding, for example, or, it began with smaller things like dinner in a restaurant. I'm not having wine, just like does not compute, up to like a wedding or a birthday party or a vacation, like no cocktails on vacation. What? And it was only when I removed the alcohol that I realized how strong my cravings were and how obsessed I became about wanting a drink in situations where I was expecting to have a drink. So that's when I got to thinking, am I an alcoholic then? Am I in denial because I have these very strong cravings for alcohol? And eventually, I've been questioning my drinking for about 9 years. And about 5 years in, I was really not drinking very much at all. But I did go to a few AA meetings because the overall dominant messaging was like, if you're questioning your drinking at all, if there's ever a situation where you find it hard to say no to a drink, you're an alcoholic and you need to be in AA and you must abstain from alcohol. So I kind of was like, okay, I'm obviously in denial. I need to just like do this. But found myself in meetings with people sharing stories that did not reflect my story. And I really felt like an imposter. Here were people who had really been brought to their knees by this substance and by their addiction. And there was me kind of like, oh, it's hard for me not to have that glass of wine sometimes. It was like, there's like,
right,
it felt almost disrespectful to what was happening, to the deep pain and healing that was happening in those rooms. I didn't feel like I had any right to be there really. And so I was confused because I still wanted to be able to openly talk about this conflicted relationship I had with booze and understand why it was so difficult for me not to drink in certain situations. So that's when I started writing and talking more about this idea of being sober curious. And I started an event series in New York called Club Soda NYC, which was really designed to kind of remove some of the stigma from this conversation because it's not something that's spoken about widely, even though alcohol is something that touches all of our lives. It's absolutely the norm to drink in our culture, and yet none of us are ever encouraged to question how we drink, why it's so prevalent, why there's so much pressure to drink sometimes.
There's a lot in there. I'm gonna reverse, there's so many things, and I want to reverse engineer that a little bit. Starting with the end, and that is culturally, as you're speaking and I'm listening to your accent, I'm thinking back to a lot of time that I spent in the UK years ago. I think I did like 5 pretty long trips there and playing music and stuff. And I always found it fascinating. And this is at a time when I had already quit drinking years before, because I was one of those people that had a serious, life-threatening problem with it. Not just like, I don't know, maybe this is an issue. It's like, no, it's very obviously an issue. So anyway, I'm in the UK, and what I thought was so weird, and this would be, in England, Scotland, Ireland, all over them islands over there, And it'd be like 4 p.m, you walk down the street and all the pubs are full and people are drinking. The interesting thing to me, though, is that other than really late at night, which, a lot of the pubs, for people that don't know, close really early, which was very strange to me. It's like 10 p.m. and the bars are shutting down. I'm like, what is wrong with you people?
That's why everyone starts early.
Is that the deal? Oh, okay, yeah.
You have to, it's going to be last orders at like 10:30, 11. So you have to start at 4 so you can get enough drinks in before it closes.
Okay, so you just solved part of the mystery for me. But what was interesting is I didn't really see anyone pissed drunk other than, like, I think I was in, Glasgow.
Right.
And it seemed like some of the bars either let out later or there were nightclubs or something that were on a different sort of time schedule. And I remember one night I went out to get some curry and like the streets were just full of just wasted people, like, guys that you wouldn't, I was like finding myself a little nervous actually because people were so hammered and the guys are pretty rowdy,
Yeah, it can get
footballer
violent.
kind of energy, right?
There's a big drinking culture around the kind of like football rivalry and
Yes. So I don't know if it was game night or what the hell was going on, but I was like,
just Friday night.
I was like, oh shit, these people are wasted. But other than that, I mean, most of the time it seems like a very casual thing and it's just embedded into the culture. Whereas in the States, I mean, if you're like, hey, everyone, let's go to the bar and like get hammered at 4 p.m. I mean, even like a normal person is kind of like, dude, it's too early to be drinking. You don't drink in the daytime, right? So I'd like to talk
Unless
about
it's brunch. Can we just talk about bottomless brunch? We don't have bottomless brunch in the UK.
Oh, that's funny,
Not to, like, compare
right.
and contrast, but I think that there are definitely differences in our drinking cultures. I think what I've noticed, people drink a lot more spirits here. So it's a lot kind of harder and faster, the drinking, and it does go on later. Like bars in New York are open until 4 a.m. and people are there until 4 a.m. It's like, it's different. And I also wonder if, because the US is so much more of a driving culture, I wonder if more drinking happens at home, actually kind of behind closed doors, and we don't necessarily see so much of the kind of really alcoholic drinking because it's actually happening in people's homes.
Interesting observation. Right.
I wonder. I mean, I don't know. But.
Right. So other than just cultural norms, have you seen any indications that there's genetic predispositions to drinking too much, or people, I've heard it said, and I don't at all know that this is true, but like Asian people don't take alcohol very well and they can't drink very much. They turn red and have sort of this allergic reaction. And again, I'm making a huge generalization here, and I don't know that that's a fact, but it is sort of like a cultural meme, I guess you could say, like, oh yeah, Asians can't take their alcohol and stuff like that. Whereas if someone has Irish blood or something, I can drink like an Irishman and, nothing will put me down. And there's sort of like this also pride with certain cultures about how much they can drink. Yeah. Have you researched at all just genetically if certain people are more predisposed or can kind of handle the drinking better than others?
It's interesting. I've heard that thing about Asian people as well. And it's something I have noticed kind of like just generally in passing, I suppose. But I honestly think it's more about cultural conditioning. I think I have like Nordic, in the UK, there's kind of like Celtic Nordic blood. And I just think of Vikings with like huge tankards of ale and mead, like the pagans making mead and stuff. I just think that drinking has always been part of the kind of like Celtic pagan, sort of Western European lineage, But yeah, and I like I said, I do think it's more about cultural conditioning than necessarily genetic disposition and the way that we learn about what it means to be a drinker. A big part of my mission with this whole book and the whole kind of conversation I'm starting around this, like just really opening up this subject for discussion, is to make it as normal not to drink as it is to drink.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, and I'd be curious to hear your backstory with alcohol as well. Most of the legal drinking age is 21, but I would say in this country and 18 in the UK. I would say that most people probably have their first exposure to alcohol in their early teens, if not even earlier. I actually interviewed Moby for my podcast recently. Have you read his books?
No, I haven't.
Oh, really fantastic. The second one is a kind of a rock bottom memoir. It just came out this week, actually. It's called Then It Fell Apart. Anyhow, check that out. It's a really good book. But, he started drinking aged around 12. And I've spoken to other people who've had more serious problems with alcohol. And 12 seems to be a kind of like, I do sort of think the earlier that you find alcohol as a way to soothe whatever pain, existential pain you're experiencing, the more likely you are to have problems later in life. You know, obviously those drinking ages have been put in place for a reason. And I wonder actually, when our brains are still forming in our adolescence and early teens, it's very much easier for those neural pathways that associate feeling good or a sense of relief or escape with alcohol to be formed and grooved, kind of like worn much more deeply into the grooves of the brain, and therefore harder to undo, you know?
Absolutely.
So I think that, yeah, I mean, we have these legal drinking ages in place, but I know very few people who actually waited until they were 18 or 21 to have a drink,
like,
right?
It's like sex. I mean, I guess there's no legal age
like,
there, but
it's
who wants
like
to wait?
As soon as possible.
Yeah.
It's almost seen as a badge of honor,
Yeah.
like to do to experience these kind of transitions into adulthood. And alcohol very much in our culture is, I think, seen as a sort of a rite of passage into adulthood, you know? The idea of going out drinking with your parents when you're 21 is kind of like welcome to the world of adulthood, you know?
Yeah.
And the assumption behind that is really that as a grown up, as an adult human being, you're going to be a drinker. Imagine if we were given both options from early on in our lives. I think possibly fewer people who go on to have serious alcohol problems would even begin drinking in the first place. Perhaps they might just find other ways to, you know, soothe whatever's hurting. It's interesting. There's tons of studies coming out about how millennials and Generation Zs are drinking a lot less, like seriously declining drinking among younger age groups. And at first I was kind of thinking...
Is that because weed is
this is the
so
thing,
prevalent?
Right? At first I was like, oh, they have social media, so they don't have the intimidation of going into bars. Like, they're socializing in different ways.
Right, they're socializing by staring at a device.
They're socializing like this. There's a different kind of social anxiety.
Right.
There's anxiety that comes
How many
with
likes
that.
did I get?
Exactly.
Versus like, how do I ask the girl at the high school dance?
How do I look, or who's looking at me, or what am I saying, you know? But actually, yeah, I just wonder if it's because weed is starting to be legalized more places. If prescription drugs are becoming more available to people at younger ages, I think a lot of kids are on Adderall and things like that. So I don't necessarily think that that younger generations drinking less is any indication that we're, again, getting down to we're actually doing anything to address the root cause of it. I heard, again, the same psychiatrist friend told me that anti-anxiety medication is essentially alcohol in a pill in terms of what it does to the brain.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think that the fact people are being prescribed more medication is ultimately just we've all heard the term self-medicating in terms of like using alcohol that way. And so, yeah, maybe people are just getting medicated in other ways now instead.
Well, this goes back to what you were saying about addictive behaviors being a response to trauma. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't need a scientist or any studies to tell me that that's the case, at least subjectively. I mean, that was absolutely my experience. And there wasn't the prevalence of psychiatric medications or just pharmaceuticals in general being prescribed. So when I was a kid and there was trauma, I mean, the adults didn't know, and they were on their own kind of trip anyway, and probably weren't in a place where they could have been supportive, even if they had known. But I had to kind of like suss out myself how to deal with pain. And there wasn't, we need to take Luke to the psychiatrist and then they're going to give me Adderall or Xanax or whatever. It was just like, you're in trouble all the time at school, and then there's discipline maybe for your acting out, but not really addressing the root cause. And so I see, as someone who was in a lot of pain, found my own means by which to treat that pain, which was quite effective, to be honest. I mean, that's why
it's very effective.
As someone who, you know, I don't do drugs and alcohol and stuff, but I don't have anything against it because it serves its purpose for certain people, especially if there's no other alternative. So in my case, there just was no alternative. So smoking weed was amazing. I mean, that's the only way I think I didn't kill myself when I was a kid, honestly. And I'm not even being dramatic at all. I was suicidal for years, but then, you know, I had that to go to, or then I would find alcohol, which was kind of not my preferred medicine, but it still did the trick. And then get into recovery later in life, seeing that when you remove the medicine, the illness is still there, you know, and I think that's the thing a lot of people don't realize that have gone really far into active addiction or alcoholism is it seems like that's what the problem is. And this is what's so sort of confusing about the process of being a sober person is that your whole, like my whole adolescence and young adulthood was like, dude, you're an alcoholic, you're an addict. This is what's wrong with you. And all of the problems with the authorities and all the stuff that comes along with that is a result of your behavior because you're drunk or you're high all the time. And the people that you're associating with are of, lower consciousness, right? And there's consequences. So then you think, cool, so I just need to get rid of this outward behavior, stop drinking, stop using, and then I'll be a great person and I won't have any problems. And then actually what happens is the opposite of that for someone like me. As you get sober and you're like, oh shit, I have all this trauma to deal with, all these negative ways of thinking and experiencing reality. And really what is at the core of that is a lack of spiritual connection and meaning and human connection and love and all of those things that were perhaps not present earlier on. So I'm really hopeful about the concept that you're bringing to the table, that like when it does reach the point of an acute addiction, that the first thing you need to go look at is the trauma and the plant medicines and all the different means by which one can heal that trauma through spiritual practices, etc. It's like once you deal with the trauma, then the need to go self-medicate is removed. It's not even about removing the medication. It's about removing the need for the medication.
Exactly. Treating the actual, going to the root cause of whatever it is that's hurting, And I also, I was nervous there may be some criticism of Sober Curious in kind of, in that it may encourage people who have a more serious drinking problem to think, oh, it's okay if I can be sober curious, I can still drink here and there. For some people, that's most definitely not an option, right? However, I actually think this is going to help. There's a term, early exiter. Have you heard that?
No.
So they say that alcoholism is a progressive disease, right?
Sure.
And so like I said, I've acknowledged I was a little bit addicted to alcohol. It wasn't causing me kind of like life or death issues. However, I do wonder, had I continued drinking in the way that I was without addressing it, had some kind of a life trauma happened to me, had I got a divorce, had one of my parents died, had I had a serious accident or an illness or lost all my work or something, would that drinking, that already kind of ingrained kind of habitual drinking, heavy habitual drinking, have turned into something more serious? And so I think, the term early exiter refers to somebody who kind of like arrests the progression.
Someone who pulls the parachute early.
Someone who pulls the parachute early.
Right.
And then actually there's a theory that it's actually harder for an early exiter to stop because there is no rock bottom. There's no life
absolutely.
or death. You have to stop now. So that kind of like middle ground, that procrastination around it, which can ultimately be super draining and very debilitating anyway. If you're spending a lot of time obsessing over whether or not you're drinking too much, can actually be distracting massively, from caretaking in your family or from you doing your job properly or just kind of like your overall well-being. That can stretch out over years. So I'm really hoping that this
really
can actually help people before it gets to a really serious full stop.
That's amazing.
To actually kind of like withdraw in a more subtle and like positive circumstances.
That's really powerful because, again, I can only base my own commentary on my subjective experience. For me, because things had gotten so bad, there was no option of curtailing it or just, just on the weekends. I mean, I tried all that kind of stuff, right? And so in order for me to find the help that I needed, there had to be this deep, deep surrender experience, this sort of almost like a religious conversion experience where I was just like, oh my God, I have to stop this, and realizing the point that you don't in and of yourself have the power to do that. And then the magic there is in that surrender experience of really seeking God earnestly with the utmost core humility, like the absolute, you're just beating your lick. There's no shred of your ego that's like, no, man, I got this. It's like, I'll just go to the gym more. Yeah. All of your, every little out and every trick that you've played to go into denial and, you've evaded the legal system, whatever the case may be, tricked all your friends, all the games that people play when they psychologically realize they have a problem. Now they have to hide it or try to fix it themselves. But everyone I've known in my life, and most of the people I know are people that have a similar background as myself, because you just birds of a feather flock together, and we all just, we kind of have a certain peculiar mental twist that helps us relate to one another and support each other. But I know very few people that were like, I don't know, I was like every other weekend getting a little too drunk, so I went to AA and like surrendered my life to God. I mean, that just it doesn't happen very often. And I have
Right.
observed that it is much harder for people that haven't really hit that rock bottom, because it's much more difficult to surrender and seek an earnest spiritual way of life, which to me has been the solution,
Yeah, right.
is really having some relationship with a higher power in my life that becomes more than just, oh yeah, every here and there in a yoga class, I think I feel something, but actually relating to everyday life moment to moment from the spiritual perspective. And having that surrender happen is very difficult if you haven't had your ass kicked.
Exactly.
So I think
Because the ego
that's a
is still
really
kind of like, it's okay, I got this. I
Yeah.
got this. And that can go on for years, like
Yeah.
I said. And it's interesting. I've spoken before about how people go to AA and find spirituality when they get sober. I found spirituality through launching my platform, The Numinous, and writing my first book, Material Girl, Mystical World. And that's what led me to sobriety, because it was still making that connection to a higher power, to really having faith that I was supported and that there was, a higher purpose to my life, I suppose, and a deeper meaning to my existence, that actually really shone a light on how I was using alcohol and how alcohol was actually separating me from that on a daily, weekly basis. And that actually I'd been seeking that kind of a connection to something that felt like magic or transcendence or something greater than me in getting drunk. There's a whole chapter on spirits and spirituality.
I love that chapter. It's toward the end. Can you talk a little bit? I guess we're just kind of going at this from all different angles in a non-linear way, which is fine. I often have conversations like this that don't make any sense in the terms of the chronological order of topics, but I do find this fascinating that you touched on that, because give us some stuff on the word spirits and like what is the spiritual the spiritual yearning that people have that they're trying to fill with alcohol, and give us some context on that, because it's really interesting.
It's really fascinating, and it's something that exists for me in the numinous. That word numinous means the unknown or the unknowable. It's the kind of like the great mystery of life, and I think that alcohol as a substance lives there for me. Actually, I've always found it fascinating that it's called spirits, and the official kind of reason is that when the process of distillation was first invented, meaning alcohol was extracted from whatever was being distilled. What was distilled was thought to be the spirit or the essence of that substance. So in a way, we can think of our spirit as our essence, like an undefinable sort of life force that exists within us, that's connects us to all other beings and to all other life on earth, right? That's kind of how I think about my spirit. So there's something in every plant that is also its spirit. And alcohol is that essence.
Whoa, alcohol is a plant medicine.
Alcohol is a spirit. I mean, some kind of core, like indigenous religions will believe that, or traditions will believe that alcohol is a spirit, is a demonic spirit. Because alcohol is a spirit that wants to embody like humans, so that this spirit can have a human experience and satisfy its kind of like earthy, carnal desires.
Whoa.
So fun. You should speak to Shaman Durek about this. He has a lot to say.
That's one of the things I haven't talked to Durek about, actually.
He's very anti-alcohol, and he's one of the shamans who doesn't use any plant medicines, because he believes we really do have everything we need to heal ourselves within ourselves. But yeah, there are theories around alcohol actually being a spirit. I mean, a demonic spirit. I don't know. Personally, I try to cultivate a neutral mind around this, right? I don't necessarily like using the words good or bad or right or wrong. I don't think there's anything good, bad, right or wrong about drinking, about sobriety. It's really all about like integrity and finding what your truth is. And I just, I think, like I said, for myself, when I'm really in integrity, there's no need for alcohol, and it inevitably leads to negative consequences, even if my negative consequences aren't like lying in a gutter covered in vomit, like after 15 shots of vodka. You know?
Well, it's just how you were describing trauma as a subjective experience, where maybe one kid's trauma is they were the golden child and they had all these unrealistic expectations put on them, right?
Yes, that can be
athletically, in terms of grades, etc., right? And then you have one kid that was ignored and neglected, and then you have one kid that was savagely beaten or molested or something like that, and all of those things are on the spectrum of trauma. and also the spectrum of your relationship to addictive behaviors is also relative too, and you experience your own kind of pain and kind of self-trauma is the way I really look at it, right? When you're abusing yourself because you were traumatized, then there's a compounding trauma that is self-inflicted.
Absolutely. It's almost like...
And it's also relative.
I think the psychological term for it is tolerance.
Right.
When we have painful experiences, we develop a tolerance to them, but that becomes our default way of operating. So we'll almost kind of look for other similar painful experiences because that's what we're used to. It's almost what's most comfortable for us, even if it's painful. It's kind of, it's an interesting thought. And I've often wondered as well if the pain that comes with heavy alcoholic drinking is actually an easier pain to manage than the emotional pain of your unaddressed trauma. You have an answer. Like, I feel like this because I did this to my body. I feel like this because I put this stuff in my body. It's kind of black and white. Whereas I feel like this because I was abused when I was 2.5 and I don't actually kind of remember what happened. Mm-hmm. Like it's a much harder, much more challenging kind of puzzle to unravel, but it is when we put those puzzle pieces together that we can experience healing and that we can actually then understand what happened and move on in whatever kind of a way that we can. There's another amazing book called The Biology of Desire by a guy called Mark Lewis, who's an opioids addict turned brain scientist, and he really talks about the idea of sort of healing narrative medicine, like the idea of being able to put all of the pieces of our story together in a way that makes narrative sense to us as a really important part of healing from addictions. Just understanding whatever it was that led us to this point of abusing ourselves in that way, and being able to make sense of it as a way of sort of making peace with it.
On the spirits, I'm still obsessed with this idea
it's very interesting.
of the spirits, and I think the Latin root of spirits in terms of alcohol is espiritu or something to that effect. There's an interesting factoid historically in relation to this observation, and that is years and years into the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson's life. So maybe, I don't know, he's 20 plus years sober and he's kind of stepped out of the leadership role of that organization, et cetera. And he started writing letters to Carl Jung, and they had some correspondence. And Carl Jung had been very unsuccessful at treating an alcoholic that came to see him. And that alcoholic eventually came back to the United States. He was going, I think, to Switzerland or wherever and seeking treatment. He's this wealthy guy named Roland Hazard, and he would go to Carl Jung, get treated a couple times, and it didn't work. And finally, Carl Jung was like, dude, I don't know what to help you. I can't, all my skills are insufficient in helping you overcome this issue you have with alcohol. He said, however, I have seen in some rare cases that people with your problem and people that have a mind like you have, which is really at the core of, addictive behavior, is a mind that just tortures you, and you have to shut that mind off. He said, I have seen people go and have spiritual or religious experiences and be relieved of this obsession. And so the guy comes back to America and joins this thing called the Oxford Groups, which was sort of a non-denominational Christian group, sort of a precursor to 12-step programs where there was, group testimony and group support, and they had this system of steps similar. I think there were 6 of them or something like that. Anyway, the guy comes back and he gets sober by becoming spiritual. And then he meets another guy, and then the other guy goes, and he's a friend of Bill Wilson's. And basically the story is Bill Wilson getting sober and then, co-founding this movement that has now become obviously worldwide and so many different addictions and issues people have. And at the core of that, he was writing Carl Jung to say, hey, thank you. You probably have no idea, but you're partly responsible for the foundation of this thing that's helped millions of people around the world. And so Carl Jung writes him back and said, yeah, I always wondered what happened to that guy. And I'm so glad that he ended up getting sober because I couldn't help him. And then goes on to briefly explain that he always had this sense that when people drink alcohol, what they're looking for is an experience of God. And it's a shortcut, but it's also a facsimile of the real experience. And so in order for someone who is addicted to alcohol to recreate that spiritual experience and fulfill that yearning, they have to go seek an experience of God.
Yes.
That's real.
Right. So
it's really interesting, right? So especially with the word.
Demonic spirit, like masquerading as God to seduce us into this kind of because we have this desire, we have this desire, right? This innate human desire for a kind of a union with the divine oneness. You know, in a way, maybe that's what happens to us after we die. Like, I hope so. You know, but I think, we are absolutely looking for that in alcohol and other substances. You know, Ram Dass talked about LSD in that way, and how he would go visit God on his trips on LSD and then just be so devastated that he had to come back, you know, that it ended. And so that led him on his spiritual quest of like, I want to experience that union, but I don't want to have to end in such a kind of abrupt and painful way. So I think that with most of our drug experiences, particularly psychedelics in a way, and I guess it's interesting, like alcohol isn't classed as psychedelic, but you can definitely hallucinate on alcohol. And
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, you can tell by the phone calls you've made and the text you've made the next day.
You were out there. You were out of it.
Who said this? That was you, man.
Well, that's the thing, right? We call it getting out of it. And I think that there's the terminology around alcohol use is really interesting when you start to look at it. It's kind of like we want to get out of this earthly, three-dimensional kind of experience into something that feels more magical and free, and where there are no rules and there are no labels being put on us left, right, and center, and we can just kind of like express ourselves freely. And so, I do think that within our alcohol, in fact, Russell Brand wrote about this in his book, Recovery too, that, you know, the yearning to drink is a spiritual yearning. And so we have to use the language of spirituality and the language of spirit in order to kind of address that yearning.
That's funny, the languaging around that. I actually never thought of that. Like, I got so wasted. I was hammered. Oh, man, I was destroyed. I was floored. You know, they never have a positive connotation. I was so uplifted. I felt so angelic. You know, it's always like I was trashed. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So interesting. Shit-faced.
Yeah, shit-faced. Yeah, that's maybe the best one. I'm actually going to keep that one. That one's actually really apropos. What are some of the... If you know, like, what are some of the physical effects? Like, what would be a reason, even if someone's like, I don't know, spiritually I feel amazing, I have great friends, I'm happy, and maybe I sense that alcohol makes me feel like shit and I have a hangover. What are some of the physical, you know, the quantifiable physical negative effects of drinking?
Well, it's interesting. I can share some, but I don't think they'll necessarily make a difference to anyone's drinking, because we all sort of know that alcohol is bad for us. We know it's a toxin. It's actually, it's not that often reported. It's the third leading cause of preventable deaths in the US.
What?
Right? It major contributor to cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's. Obviously, there's the hundreds of thousands of people who are killed in drink driving accidents every year. It's a really, it wreaks havoc on our kind of like physical well-being. But it's interesting. There's another kind of part of our biology / psychology that's all about. It's called now appeal, and that's our wiring, which will reach for whatever it is that's going to make us feel better fastest. Mm-hmm. We want it now, right?
I'm familiar.
Yeah.
I think my current is ice cream or something sugary.
Social media.
Yeah.
That's
Instagram.
It's got Insta now appeal, right. Basically, yes. Right. But it literally is, because every like gives us a dopamine hit. That's what we're going for. We want dopamine and we want it now. So talking to someone about like, hey, in 30 years' time, this might contribute to cancer, or like this might kind of like bring these health risks further down the line. It can't really stand up against the now appeal of a shot of tequila when you're feeling like shit, or even if it's a glass of wine on a Friday night when you just want to press stop
tequila.
On the week. No, tequila. No, I never loved.
No, I'm just kidding. I didn't really like tequila myself, but I'm remembering the instantaneous relief. Like, you walk in a place, you have social anxiety, a couple shots of whatever that's strong,
and it's gone.
Yeah, that warm burn, it's like,
the now appeal.
Yeah.
So talking, and I think it's very
quick.
telling that the fact we do know alcohol is bad for us, we kind of, those reports will come out. I think the most recent report that came out last year was even saying, one glass of wine a day can severely increase a woman's risk of breast cancer.
Really?
These they don't really land.
Damn.
And I think that says so much about how much people are actually hurting, whether it's acute pain or whether it's just social anxiety, or feeling the discomfort of being a working mum and knowing you've only got an hour to yourself this week, and you just want to feel like yourself as quickly as possible and
Yeah.
forget about everything else. The discomfort of that is so powerful and potent that people are willing to override or ignore or overlook all of what we know are the negative consequences
Right.
of alcohol. Whether we know we might be addicted, whether we know it might cause us further health problems down
You
the line,
just
or whether
described-
we know we're going to wake up hungover tomorrow. We're willing to ignore all of that because we feel so shit right now. We just want whatever's going to work
Yeah.
quickest,
You
which
just
I think is where we really need to look.
I'm thinking of a few nights ago, I was at this retreat up in Mount Shasta with one of our former guests, John Wineland, and on the final night before he left, they served pizza. And, I don't do so well with gluten and dairy for that matter. And they had some gluten-free pizza, but it was like a longer line. I just thought, you know what? Screw it. And I'll just have one piece of pizza. It's not going to hurt. I sat there and had like literally 8 or 9 pieces of gluten pizza. And it was like an opiate. I mean, I could not stop. But in that moment, it felt so good that I don't care how many podcast guests I've had on that tell me that leaky gut and inflammation and like all that. I was like, that just became noise in the face. Literally, like having pizza in my face was just, there weren't other options available, is what I'm saying, that were readily available that sounded. And I was like, the gluten-free pizza is probably going to hurt my stomach just as much because it's made with some weird grains and stuff. So, I just went for it. But you're so right. I don't think that the motivation of saying, there's long-term effects or 1 in 2 women, breast cancer, like none of that really matters in the moment. When you're at happy hour with all your coworkers and everyone's like, what? You're not going to have a drink? What's wrong with you, dude? Loosen up. Why are you so uptight? And you're like, oh, yeah, you're right. And then there you go. And you're able to edge out all of the data that you might have accumulated to the contrary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just brought up something that's such a huge subject as well. For so many people, it's a barrier, especially when you don't have that kind of rock bottom problem. The peer pressure to drink is just insane. And people say to me, this is such an important conversation for women because of the risks of breast cancer, because of the whole kind of money.
What were the stats again? Did I get?
I think it's like 1 glass of wine increases a woman's risk of breast cancer by like 50%. I don't know if I'm not exactly sure if that's exactly right. We can maybe look it up, but it definitely
the detail of the numbers, but there's definitely an indication there that that's interesting.
So people ask me this, and alcohol is the number 1 date rape drug. Like 89% of people who've been sexually assaulted were incapacitated by alcohol, when half the time we're worried about what might get put in our drink without thinking about the fact that once you're drunk, you're so much more susceptible and vulnerable to being attacked or abused. So there's those issues, and people say, it's a really important conversation for women. And I'm like, and for men, because particularly in this culture, there's such a kind of bro culture of like sports and drinks. And that's kind of like how I see a lot of men bonding. And I just know from watching other kind of, hetero guys for having a really hard time with the peer pressure that can come of like being the dude who doesn't want to drink, who's seen as kind of like weak or not so macho or like not one of the guys or whatever it is.
It's a badge of honor.
Huge challenge. Exactly.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like, not that I went to college, but I've seen it in the movies, frat culture and all that. Like there's so many like adolescent rituals with men that or boys that involve drinking.
Exactly.
And even
it's
the
almost
drinking,
like the rite of passage. We see kind of like in tribal cultures, like a boy reaches the age of 14 and he has to go fight a lion or like, jump off a cliff to prove his manhood. Here it's like, drink 10 shots.
Right. Do a beer bong.
Exactly.
Until you puke.
Exactly.
Yeah, you did it, bro. So that's one thing I would like to talk about too. What are some alternatives then to, other than obviously just going to events or socializing with people that are also just like, we don't need alcohol. Let's find another way to have fun. But I'm thinking of a few things. Social events. If you want to dance, I mentioned something to my girlfriend earlier. I was like, Ruby's coming over. She's doing this whole sober curious thing. And my girlfriend's not a heavy drinker by any means. That would be difficult, I think.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be a great match. But, she likes to have a drink here and there. And she's like, oh, God, how can you not drink when you go out dancing? And I was like, that's a really good point.
That was one of my big sober curious questions.
The only time in my life I've ever danced was maybe 2 or 3 times. I was hammered and I was able to be free and just, one was at a James Brown concert and I was also on mushrooms.
Okay.
If you're on mushrooms and alcohol and James Brown is performing in front of you, it's very difficult to not dance.
Action, yeah.
You'd have to be a corpse or a zombie to not dance. But she brought that up and I was like, oh, that's true. And then I'm thinking about something you covered in your book is like dating and sex. the social lubricant, no pun intended. But I mean, I remember when I first quit drinking, just to ask a girl out without being drunk, let alone go on a date or try to make the first move, or God forbid if it ever got to the point of actual physical intimacy. I mean, it was terrifying because I'd never, ever, never once had sex sober in my life before age 26.
Which is very much the case for a lot of people, I will imagine, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, these are all very challenging situations. I talk a lot about sober firsts, and like they don't get easier. They're always going to be extremely challenging. And the only way out is through.
Right.
You have to confront them. And I'm sure you've experienced this. The more you do these things, the more you put yourself in that scary situation and you prove to yourself, or you show to yourself, I didn't take a drink. Nobody died. In fact, I actually feel pretty good about myself coming out of this without a hangover and knowing that I can do this without a drink. It's actually it's really confidence building. And they do get easier with time, but there are always going to be situations. And I'm just so thankful that there are now, really only in the past like 6 to 8 months or so, tons of alcohol-free options that just seem to be kind of blossoming everywhere. There's a couple of alcohol-free bars in New York now that literally opened in the past couple of months.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
And they pay the bills?
Yeah.
So far.
Well, there's one that's a
so far,
pop-up,
so
a monthly pop-up called Listen Bar that takes over a regular bar and does an alcohol-free night once a month. And then there's a brick and mortar bar called Getaway in Greenpoint in Brooklyn that's like pure, complete zero proof. They don't even serve alcohol-free beer because it has 0.5% or kombucha.
Right. Did any of these places, I'm curious, if they don't, do you see this as being a viable alternative, like a kava bar or something that uses different herbs and plants that are relaxing and calming and give you that, you know, not the same kind of social lubricant, but around like a ritual of like, hey, we're all drinking this special pot of tea or this or that, and there's something to at least consume that might have some.
Well, yeah, there are options
slightly
like
mind-altering, like mind-altering effect to a lesser degree, or one that doesn't have consequences.
Yes, there are the Assemblage, which is a members bar club in New York. They have something called it's an alcohol-free members club. And they have an elixir bar, which has lots of these kinds of concoctions that you're talking about. There is a kava bar in East Village. I've never checked it out, but have meant to. I've had kava myself, and it has a pleasing mouth-numbing effect.
Yeah.
For when you're looking for something that makes you feel a bit more
I actually have
like
an
something's
episode.
happening.
I have an episode coming out. It's like an hour-and-a-half interview all about kava. It's a fascinating. Yeah. It just as a complete aside here, just for, this is like the conversation that would happen off mic, but it's really interesting. Those classifications of pharmaceuticals called benzodiazepines, I believe is how you say it, like Valium and Xanax, that are affect your nervous system and calm you down. Kava hits the same receptors in your brain as benzos, and so you can actually use, if you have high quality and like the right kind of kava and the right dosage, you can use it to wean off of benzos.
Very interesting.
And I'm not giving a medical claim that suggests people do so, but I learned so much in that conversation. Now I'm like, I got this kava from this company called Noble Roots, which is the guy that I interviewed. And I love that stuff. And
I got some when I went to Hawaii.
It's really?
It originates from Hawaii.
Yeah,
right?
they do grow it there. Yeah, and Fiji, a couple other places.
Right. So there are, that's an alternative. There's a drink called Kin Euphorics that has 5-HTP in it, which is, it's plant derived and it's a serotonin boosting substance. And people who are heavily into MDMA will take it like the next day to kind of like mitigate the come down effects.
I just learned that. So I was looking into, I don't know that I'm going to go there, but I was looking into the efficacy and the popularity now, and even the medically legal acceptance of using MDA as it was originally intended as a therapeutic agent, right?
Yes.
Couples therapy, things like that.
Oh, PTSD. Yeah,
PTSD.
Johns Hopkins trials are being done for that. Yeah.
So that's exciting, and it's funny because as we talk about alcohol, I don't really see a lot of benefit to alcohol, but even someone that doesn't typically recreationally do drugs, I am a huge believer in the benefit and the sort of medical use of drugs, whether that be cannabis, MDMA, psilocybin, ayahuasca. I mean, these things have a place.
Absolutely.
It's just, I think a lot of it has to do with intention, set and setting. Like, why are you doing it to escape from yourself, or are you doing it to go deeper into yourself? Mm-hmm. And when I finally, after like years of debating, went and did ayahuasca, I knew in my heart that I was doing it to really learn more about myself. It wasn't to try and numb some pain. No, my life's fucking awesome. Like, I'm celebrating how beautiful my life is 99.9% of the time. So it was about going inward. But what are some, alternatives that you see where people might be able to have altered states of consciousness in a public setting or in a ceremonial way that don't have those negative consequences.
Well, it's interesting just to note that most of the substances you mentioned, LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, ayahuasca, these are what are known as evocative therapies. Whereas alcohol, cannabis to an extent, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, these are suppressive therapies. So what we rely on very much in Western medicine and in Western society in general, alcohol being a case in point, is where there is pain, suppress it, make it go away as quickly as possible.
Right.
Whereas what you're describing are, I haven't done ayahuasca myself, but what I understand is that it's typically a dark night of the soul kind of experience, and you're likely to be seeing the root of your pain and to experience that pain again. And if you're with someone who knows what they're doing, they're going to guide you deeper into that. Same with an LSD, and same with, the medical uses of things like MDMA, LSD, psilocybin. If a painful experience comes up on those trips, the right thing to do is, okay, let's go deeper into this and let's look at it in the face and let's actually confront that demon once and for all. And that is how you have an emotional catharsis and actually kind of can move on from that traumatic experience.
The difference between a healing experience and an avoidant experience.
Exactly. Right. You can have a catharsis where it's actually released rather than getting squished further down into your cells to perhaps become cancerous at some point later in life, Which again, not making any medical claims here, but these are just kind of theories that I have been playing with myself. But thinking about evocative therapies, but that doesn't necessarily have to involve taking a substance. Like talk therapy is an evocative therapy if you have a good therapist who's going to actually get you to speak about what happened. And that can be done in a group setting with friends, like an intentional kind of sharing circle. It's what happens at AA.
Yeah.
The story sharing is people evoking the memory and the experiences again to kind of have a release of those experiences.
I think in many ways that practice, especially when it's verbalized, it's almost like this. It has religious connotations to me. It's like giving testimony.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, in a really like stereotypical religious, it'd be like, oh, this is the way the devil got me, and then you're kind of going through that and cleansing yourself of that by sharing it and being vulnerable and open about your experience, and that authenticity and humility that comes with really being courageous enough to look at yourself and then sharing that with other people.
And then having other people see it and accept you, despite that flaw or that trauma or that shameful thing that happened.
And having them go, yeah, that happened to me, or I felt that way. I guess it's
healing.
The foundation of group therapy sort of comes out of that model, right? Of one person saying, hey, this is my truth, testifying in front of a group of their peers, and having that unconditional love and acceptance and compassion reflected back to them.
Exactly.
And that shared experience where you're like,
Whereas
I felt like that.
Think about how it happens in Catholicism, for example, behind closed doors in a hidden room. You can't even look at the priest. It's but it's the same thing of this confession, this idea of confessing your sin is actually what helps it to be released, rather than you having to hold on to that sin or that resentment or that shame or whatever it is. But anyway, in terms of other kind of experiences, like breathwork is an amazing practice for having that kind of like almost psychedelic emotional release,
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar? You have interviewed Deborah Hannekamp, right? Mama
Yeah,
Medicine.
sure.
So she performs medicine readings where she kind of channels the spirit of the ayahuasca plant. I'm talking like an American. Of the ayahuasca plant. In a reading, and she'll sing the Icaros, the medicine songs. So she's not using the substance, but she's kind of like giving her clients an experience of a kind of that same sort of spiritual release. So there are definitely tools out there and practices out there that we are getting more and more access to, where we can look at some of the deeper causes behind our addictions, whether they're severe addictions, whether they're just kind of like things that are getting in the way of us living our best life.
I really love the idea of this popularity. I mean, for lack of a better term, a trend of having people say, hey, we want to come together and socialize and have fun and hear music and dance and, the whole mating rituals that go on in nightlife and things like that. Mm-hmm. And we want to do that without the inclusion of alcohol. I think that's a really healthy step for people. And again, I'm not anti-alcohol. Like, listen, to be honest, if I could have a shot here or there, have a couple beers here and there without my life completely crumbling, I probably would. I'm real. I'm honest about this. But I think there are a lot of people, as you say, that want to explore community that doesn't include that because they're just health conscious or they want a deeper connection. And
Exactly.
let's face it, when two people are buzzed or drunk, you think you're really connecting, and then the next day you're like, who was that jerk?
Exactly.
You know,
What did
it's
we
like
even talk about.
Yeah, it's a diluted, for lack of, that's a very literal way to say it, but it's a diluted experience, right? Whereas working with plant medicines or even just being stone cold sober, I mean, there's a realness to it that is palpable. And this is an experience
Absolutely.
I've had for a long time. I have so
Yeah.
many situations where still, even today, I have to work through the discomfort of like, oh my God, there's so many people here. I don't know. I mean, I have that shit when I walk in a room. I'm like, all right, where's the one person? Do I know anyone here? Like, I'm going to just zero in on them, because I feel scared. And that's a normal human response, I think.
Can I just say thank you for sharing that? Because I'm always that person at an event and I'm like, everyone else is so chill. Everyone else knows everyone. And I'm just going to sit here and like play with this carrot stick until
right. Or
until the thing starts.
Here's the ultimate is having your phone in an airplane, because I don't want EMFs in my head, and like pretending like you're talking on the phone, or like pretending like you're texting. You're just like avoiding people with Instagram.
Yeah.
I do have one hack I'd like to share though. I discovered this years ago in going out in public settings. When I worked in the fashion industry, I would kind of have to like show my face at events to kind of stay engaged in that career and people and all that. So I go to these fashion events and they're super awkward.
Super awkward.
Yeah, it's just because everyone's like, it's all about what you're wearing and all this stuff. Not always, but there is a part of it is like that. So what I would do is I would show up really early, and I would find a good place to sit, kind of before the crowd came in, and I would like get to know the bartender's name and the person serving hors d'oeuvres, and I would kind of like just kind of take ownership of the space. And then as people would start to filter in and the room would fill up, I felt very secure in my surroundings, and I had like a good place to sit. And I'm like, oh, hey, Joe, yeah, another ginger ale, and it's like you kind of feel at home there. And then it's as if the crowd is kind of coming into your space rather than you showing up late and it's all busy and you're trying to meander your way through the crowd and find that one person and then you have to interrupt them in a conversation. And so I would just give a tip, like showing up early, and then you can also kind of like, contribute to the event with your presence. And if it's a networking kind of thing, you can get that done and then get the hell out of there and not have to stay for 6 hours.
Leaving early is another great tip.
Totally.
Like when I think about how many times I was like, oh, I suppose I'll have another drink, thinking I should stay a bit longer because it would be rude to leave now. So I guess I'll have another drink to make it bearable. When actually now I'm just like, if I'm over it, I'm leaving. Like, I don't have to stay somewhere I'm not having a good time. I can go do what I need to get done and have like zero shame about then just going straight home again.
As we start to wrap it up, because I know you have to get to the airport onto your retreat. I just for people listening, we've covered so much great stuff here, and I could go on for like another 3 hours because this topic is so fascinating and personal to me. But what might you recommend to someone who, feels as though they might have a drinking problem? They're not sure they're an alcoholic. I mean, would you say go check out some 12-step meetings and see if that fits? Go to therapy? Where would someone start if they're curious? A. B, if someone's like, oh, I'm a hardcore alcoholic. I know my life's being destroyed. I can't stop drinking. There's no denial. I'm just full blown. What are some different avenues people can take? Are there alternatives that you're aware of to doing a 12-step thing and going to rehab and kind of taking that traditional route? Like, where can people turn if they sense they do have a problem?
Well, I think the really, really, really great thing about AA is that it's free. So you literally have nothing to lose by going to check it out if you're questioning. And I'm really glad I went to the couple of meetings that I did, because if anything, it helped me to understand. It helped me it answered that question, am I an alcoholic for me? No, this is not my story. This is not what I need. Okay, good. I know that now. I can go check out other things, So I think if you are questioning your drinking, you have nothing to lose by checking out a meeting and seeing if it resonates. But I think my number one thing is really just stop drinking. And I know that's obviously for some people really challenging. If it's incredibly challenging for you to say, I'm going to stop drinking for 3 months, then if that's really a huge challenge, go to AA. Get the support you need.
You might have a problem, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Anyone who pre-ordered my book got to do a guide, what I was calling a guided 100-day reset. A lot of people do a dry January now or a sober October, taking a month off drinking. And I actually don't really think that a month is long enough if you really want to experience the benefits of not drinking and really get a feel for what alcohol it's like to live without alcohol. A month is it's a bit of a novelty. goes past pretty fast. So 3 months, 100 days is actually a really good time period. So just take a break and then just really pay attention to how it feels. Really pay attention to when the cravings come and like think about what they're actually attached to, and maybe focus on that rather than the craving, you know? And yeah, use that period as time to do some self-investigation, maybe check out some therapy, or maybe try meditation if you haven't tried meditation, or check out some of these kind of alternative ways to do some self-analysis or increase your self-awareness. And one thing I would say as well, for me, it's been really helpful to focus less or even not at all on what I'm trying to remove, and really put all of my attention and focus on the things I do want in my life. You know, I want more hours in the day. I want more energy. I want great sleep. I want relationships that feel really authentic. And so focus on cultivating those things in my life, with the awareness that alcohol is one thing that prevents me from having all of those things, you know?
That's a one thing you mentioned in there. I mean, the authentic relationships, like we covered, you think you're best friends with someone. Same thing when you're doing something creative. Like I used to play music for a long time, and when I was drunk and the people I was playing with were drunk, I mean, we thought we just wrote the best song or had the best gig, and then we'd listen back to the recording and be like, oh my God, we're not even in tune. Like, we're not even musicians, for Christ's sake. But yeah, and the other thing I don't think people realize with alcohol, and again, I'm not anti-alcohol, but the awareness is important, that it like, I passed out last night, right? And you think you slept really well, but alcohol actually really screws up your sleep.
Really screws it up.
Yeah, no matter how well you think you're sleeping, if you use like my ring here, my Aura ring, if you track your sleep, you'll see that you don't get any, whether it's REM or deep, I forget.
It prevents REM sleep, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the most restorative part, which, just to finish up, okay,
think
about this.
Please,
go back to the spiritual, slightly mystical zone. So REM sleep is the most restorative part of the sleep. If we don't go there, we always wake up, we won't wake up feeling refreshed. REM sleep is also when we have our most vivid dreams and our body is completely paralyzed, almost like we have left the room. We have these vivid dreams, which is our subconscious trying to work out or kind of make sense of, or kind of sort through the experiences we've had or we're going through in our lives at the time. And I just wonder, like, where is it we're going to? Where is our spirit going when we're in REM sleep? To these deep, like shamanic, you know, it's almost like it's shamanic trance that happens every night, where we go to get some healing from these other realms, and then we come back. And alcohol prevents us from entering that part of the sleep state, which I think is why it's so hard. Even though you pass out drunk, you still wake up feeling like crap the next day, you know? Yeah.
And what would you say is the difference between, you know, in the context of the 12-step model in Alcoholics Anonymous, there's sort of classifications of alcoholics, right? You have like the hardcore alcoholic, and I'm just paraphrasing, making my own term, and that's someone that like wakes up, has a drink, drinks all day, goes into the DTs if they don't have alcohol, like someone who's physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually addicted to alcohol. Then you have the periodic, that's like, you know, they don't drink every day, they drink every 3 weeks, but they get fucking hammered and they have no control over how much they drink. Then you have kind of the maintenance drinker. My grandfather was one of those. He was an alcoholic, and he was never belligerent or crazy. But he always reeked like vodka, and he always had a vodka next to him. Kind of like Keith Richards, I think.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you never see Keith Richards wasted, but he always
he
always has that red cup next to him if you watch his interviews, and like, oh, what's in that red cup, Keith? And I mean, I've heard he, you know, is always just sipping alcohol. And so you have the maintenance drinker that just has this low level blood concentration of alcohol, but they never get out of hand. And then you have what's called a heavy drinker, which is someone who's not clinically an alcoholic, but they like to get their groove on more than the average person. So if you're listening and you're thinking, wow, I kind of fit into one of those categories, how do you think one could determine, you know, if they are clinically an alcoholic or addicted to alcohol, or just someone that just enjoys getting their rocks off?
Well, this is the thing, and maybe you can help me out with this. I think it was my friend Biet Simkin who told me that alcoholism is a self-diagnosed disease. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be true.
So I'm not sure then. The only way is to,
That's a humble answer.
To get really curious, actually do some really honest self-inquiry, be really honest with yourself. I think ultimately, you know if alcohol is a problem for you. Does it matter if you're clinically could be termed an alcoholic or not? I don't know. I'm more concerned with, how does my life look like? It doesn't need to have a label on it necessarily for me. It's like, how does my life look like? Is this thing preventing me from living a life that feels like it's mine? Then, okay, it's probably a good idea if I address this and remove it, you know?
Love it.
Yeah.
And in this conversation, as we wrap up, I'm just actually feeling so grateful that that's not an issue for me anymore.
Yeah.
Because it was
Good
for
for
so many
you.
years, it was
Yeah.
something like, God, I actually don't want to be doing this, and I can't stop. And that's a really humiliating way to live, when it's like better, and your conscious is indicating to you that you could have higher aspirations,
Yeah.
and you could be living in a way that would not only serve you but others more meaningfully, but you literally don't have the power to stop it. And I think that, to me, that's kind of the dividing line is if I really buckle down, can I stop whatever behavior it is for a long period of time? Because there's quitting, and then there's quitting, right? Or stopping versus quitting. Maybe stopping's oh, I don't do this thing for a week, but quitting is I don't care if I ever do it again, and this is super easy.
Yeah.
And to be having been sort of restored to having, I don't even think it's a willpower thing, but there's some other power that's entered into my life that just makes it a non-issue, and I'm just so grateful to be reminded of that, because as the years wear on, 22 plus of them now, it's I just kind of, oh yeah, this is just my normal life. I go out, people drink. I mean, it's not even a thing that I think about at all. But there was a time when almost every moment of the day was when do I get the next one? When do I get the next one? And how do I hide it? And how do I control it? And all of the energy that goes into that type of life. So, wow.
And I think that's great. You sharing that is, because there are so many people for whom that struggle lasts for years, and I believe truly that they're always going to have that struggle, that daily struggle. And for some people, maybe they will, but thank you for sharing that. It maybe took 20 plus years, but here you are, and it's a non-issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not something that, for most of those years up until I had a podcast, I never talked publicly ever about that. I don't know if I was ashamed. It was very private, and it wasn't something I was particularly excited to tell people. There was a bit of stigma around it, I think. And so I would go out and people say, hey, you want a drink? I'm like, no, I'm good. And they go, what's up? And I go, oh, no, I'm allergic. That's what I used to say, What happens? I break out in handcuffs. Which is quite true. So in closing, Ruby Warrington, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for coming by the house, the studio here. It's really great to see you and, get kind of an update on your life and your work. I love what you're doing. I've learned a lot from you about something I thought I was pretty well versed in. Who have been 3 teachers or teachings in your life that you might share with our audience that they could go research and also learn from?
Ooh, well, there are some books that I quote in Sober Curious on this subject in particular. The biology of desire, I will definitely recommend again. I think your audience would probably really enjoy it. It's a scientific book, but it's not at all dry. It's super human and very vivid, beautiful storytelling. So The Biology of Desire by Mark Lewis. I would say some of the breathwork sessions. So I guess I have to name check David Elliott. I've never met him before, but most of the people that I've experienced breathwork with has studied with David Elliott. His breathwork technique. Some of the people are Erin Telford, Luke Simon, Betsy LaFay. These are all breathwork practitioners, and I think it's easier and easier to find people who will offer breathwork sessions online as well if you can't get to a class or have a one-on-one. And breathwork has been something that's given me such fun experiences of really deep emotional catharsis, when
Absolutely.
It's well done well. It's a really amazing, trippy experience.
Same here.
Because I really enjoy those experiences.
Yeah.
And the thought that I can get that high without having any kind of substances or negative side effects, I'm like, hell yeah, bring it on.
Yeah, it's actually really healthy too. I mean, it's really good for you to become
Exactly.
hyper oxygenated like that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I would also say, I'll say Alexandra Roxo, who I'm going off to lead my retreat with. My friendship with her, we're in what I call a collaborationship. It's kind of deeper than a friendship, and we collaborate and make things together. But she's really helped to teach me the value of just kind of being vulnerable and sharing what's up in real time as and when it happens, even just as a friend. And I think the more we can have those kind of just open conversations with each other about what's really going on, the less we'll hold on to resentments, the less we'll hold on to shame, and the more quickly we'll just kind of be able to move on through whatever difficulties are presenting. So thank you, Alexandra, for being a friend I can do that with.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing those. And where can people find your website, social media, etc.?
So I recently, to coincide with this book coming out, started my own Instagram. So it's just at Ruby Warrington, which is kind of where I share most of my work the first. And my website is the-numinous. where it's more focused on astrology these days, as I've kind of like separated the different strands of what I do out into different channels. But the Ruby Warrington Instagram is where to get most of this stuff.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming back on.
Thanks again for having me, Luke.
Yeah, safe, sober travels to you.
Thank you.
All right, cheers.